All right, so the first-person shooter. We're actually starting from a two-dimensional game, which has a lot of this stuff at the beginning. It has a basic map that looks something like this. So if I open up this game itself and look at the actual room, I've got basically two kinds of objects in here that are vertical walls and horizontal walls. By the way, there's a parent object, which is a basic wall. So both horizontal and vertical are children of basic. And then there's this object player that's in here. Object player already has some code inside of him. And it's basically movement, kind of like you would think for a three-dimensional game. So when he's first created, he sets up friction, so he's going to slow down. Friction subtracts from his movement every step. When he goes left, he adds 3 to his direction. So that means that it moves him counterclockwise. When he goes right, it moves him, he subtracts 3 from his direction, which moves him clockwise. When he's going up, he's basically setting that if his speed is less than 2, his speed becomes a new speed, which is the smaller of 2 and whatever he has plus 0.4. The idea with this means that 2 is his maximum speed. And he has the reverse of that when he goes backwards, where he checks to see if negative 2 is his speed going backwards. So those are all just movements and guards. If he collides with the wall, he sets his speed to 0. Ooh, he's doing this in a drag and drop. I'll forgive it this time. So in his end step, basically what he's doing is he's changing his angle to direction. So for those of you that remember, that's just setting image angle to direction. All right, so if I run this, so it allows me to move. And you may be saying to yourself, hey self, this isn't a 3D game, and that's true. So we need to change some stuff to make it 3D. But it's got the basic movement. All right, so where we are starting from is turning it into a three-dimensional game. This is on page 3 at the bottom of it. Generally speaking, the pieces of code we're going to need are going to be in these yellow blocks. However, just to make it tricky, every once in a while he'll tell you important stuff in the paragraphs just before or afterwards. So if you just use the yellow blocks, your game's not going to work. Hooray. So some things we need to do about this game. All of the commands are in a D3D set of commands. So that changes whatever your game is into a three-dimensional game. So to actually make it three-dimensional, we have to start the 3D engine running, and then there's some commands we're going to do here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set things hidden to true, so that if an object is behind another object, you don't see it, which seems relatively important. Lighting. If we had lighting in here, it would matter. We're just going to turn it off for now. You can add lights in order to shade up models, but for walls, it doesn't really matter that much. Culling. Culling is a special thing in 3D where if you have, let's say, the model of an apple, it probably doesn't matter that you actually draw the inside of the apple. Like, you don't need both sides. You just need to see the outside of the apple. And so if you set culling to true, that means that the inside is not drawn. It probably won't matter that much for us, so we're just going to turn it to false. By the way, have you ever noticed in 3D games if you like glitch into a wall a little bit, you can see right through it? That's because culling is turned on in most of those games. They don't draw the inside of the wall because they're like, why would we do that? That doubles how much we have to draw. And then texture interpolation. That basically creates a smooth texture over the surface of a model rather than having giant pixelated blocks wherever you're at. So these things are going to need to go into our creation code in our player. So I'm just going to copy these for now. And in my player, when he's created, before we set friction, I'm going to do those D3D commands. So when the game first starts, now we're going to start with 3D mode. Now, we're not there yet, by the way, so if you run this and take a look at it, it looks a little funny. Notice it's upside down. what it's trying to do is it's trying to take this two-dimensional model and draw a 3D version of it, but we haven't actually told it to draw anything in 3D, so it's very confused. So it's basically only flipped the axis. All right, some other stuff we need to know. Right here it has something very important. The player object needs to set up our camera, so we need it to draw first. So I don't know if you've played with depth in two-dimensional games, but the higher the depth, the higher the number, the further behind other things it is. That also translates to that things with a higher number draw first. So because the camera needs to be set up first, and our player is going to have the camera inside of it, we need to set his depth to 100. So in the player object here, where it says depth, I need to set this to 100, because that needs to be the first thing that draws, no matter what. All right. Next, we need to grab some textures to make our walls actually look better than just gray walls. So I'm going to take these three things and import them as backgrounds. And then I'm going to use those backgrounds to draw over the top of a wall. Something to watch out for. When you are making textures, make sure that they are a power of 2. So that would be size 64 by 64, 128 by 128, 256 by 256. Each of these is multiplying by 2 each time. So the next 2 would be 512, then 1024. The reason why is that if it's not an even power of 2, it just puts in empty space to make it so it matches a power of 2. So GameMaker is a little limited in that part of things. Fortunately, these should be set up that way. So I'm going to go into my game and create 3 backgrounds. So this is going to be texture wall. I'm going to load that in from the resources in that. So if I go into my README, GameMaker 2, first-person shooter, resources, I'm going to grab this wall texture. Notice it's 128 by 128 already, which is a power of 2. There we go. Look, it's a wall texture. All right, I also need to grab the floor and ceiling. Texture floor. Load in the floor, also 128 by 128, create a texture, texture ceiling, 128 by 128. So those are the 3 things I'm going to use to start with. The floor I'm going to put across the bottom, ceiling across the ceiling. Walls are going to all look like that for now with the bricks. All right. So at the moment, none of the walls are going to show up in 3-dimensional space. We actually have to tell it where to draw them. So we actually have to give it x, y, and z coordinates. So x and y are the same way you think of. So if we look at this room, x is still left to right from this perspective, y is up and down, and z is out of what we're looking at, so out of the floor. So positive z is closer towards our eye, and negative z would be into the floor. So when we're talking about z coordinates, we're talking basically the height of things in this room. So this is an example of code that's going to be used to draw the walls. So I'm going to actually set up an x1, x2, a y1, y2, and a z1, z2. So if you imagine that in a 3-dimensional room, so if I'm drawing this particular wall here, x1, y1, z1 is going to be one corner of this wall. x2, y2, z2 is going to be the other corner of this wall. And then obviously one of these is going to be high, the other one's going to be low. And that's how it draws the actual wall in, is by taking those coordinates and drawing it. So this is going to be in the create event of, in this case, the horizontal wall, because I'm altering the x position here. So I'm going to want that. And that's going to be in the create event of the horizontal wall. So that's the code that goes in there. And then the last thing that's here is which texture are we going to use. So I created there's a variable here named tex, which is texture, not Texas. And I'm going to grab a texture from this particular one, texture wall. And so what this is doing is it's basically translating a sprite into a texture, which I can then put on an object. My wall is going to be 32 tall, by the way, from 0 to 32. The y doesn't change because it's not going to go up or well, from above, it's not going to be up or down. It's just straight across, and then the x position goes from one side to the other. Something to keep in mind, these sprites are centered, and that matters because in my x, y, and z positions, notice that I'm using x as the center. So I'm subtracting 16, and I'm adding 16.